Tune into Ballybunion is a podcast that is written, researched and presented by Ger Walsh Media. Join Ger as he explores the social history and current-day happenings of the popular North Kerry seaside town. Now, please welcome your host, Ger Walsh.
Hello and welcome to Tune Into Ballybunion, my brand new podcast series. To begin with, today in part one of a two-part story, I'll be taking a look at the origins and history of the unique Lartigue monorail which ran between Ballybunion and Listowel from 1888 to 1924. While in part two, at a future date, I will talk about the restoration of the railway which began in 1988 on its 100th anniversary. The Lartigue holds a great interest for my family as my mother's grandfather, my great-grandfather, T.C. Moore, was the general manager from 1917 until its closure in 1924. And since then, 4 generations of the Moore family have lived in the station house here in Ballybunion, including my first cousin Tom Moore, the current inhabitant. So, if you are listening at home, in the car, or even out walking with your earphones on, I hope that you will enjoy the story and thank you for tuning into Ballybunion. A huge crowd of local people cheered and clapped as a little red and green locomotive engine, towing 8 passenger carriages with over 100 people aboard, steamed into town on the leap year day of Wednesday, February 29th, 1888. This was the moment that many had dreamed about for years. The town of Ballybunion on the southwest coast of Ireland was finally connected by rail to the rest of the country. This was no ordinary train, however, that had just arrived from the market town of Listowel, 9 miles to the east. This was a monorail, running pretty much parallel to what's now the main R553 Ballybunion-Listowel Road, or the New Line Road as it was once called. The Lartigue monorail was the brainchild of French engineer Charles Lartigue, who got the idea from watching camels in the Algerian desert, carrying heavy loads balanced in panniers on their backs. So instead of having 2 conventional parallel rails on the flat, this system had a single A-shaped rail sitting above the ground at waist height, upon which the carriages sat astride like panniers. In 1881, Lartigue had built a 55-mile long monorail prototype in French Algeria, which was used to transport goods across the desert using mules rather than locomotives to pull the trains of carriages. And while a number of European railway companies showed an early interest in his unique system, sadly only 2 were ever built, one in France which was never actually used, and the other here in North Kerry, which when it opened in February of 1888 became the world's first passenger carrying monorail. However, our story begins several years before, because for many years businessmen in Ballybunion and even the local parish priest, Father O'Connor, had been campaigning to extend the Irish mainline railway network, which only ran as far as Listowel. Ballybunion was fast emerging as a holiday resort that was becoming extremely popular with people from neighbouring counties of Limerick, Cork and Tipperary, so a rail link from Listowel made sound economic sense. However, the written request to extend the rail line as far as Ballybunion was being ignored and was probably lying idle on some civil servant's desk in Westminster for years without ever being considered. And were it not for the twist of fate in 1886, the Lartigue Railway may never have been built in this locality. George Hewson of Ennismore, Listowel, the local landlord who presided over most of the land in North Kerry, including the land on which the famous Ballybunion golf course now exists, had visited London in January of 1886 to attend an agricultural show. where it so happened that Charles Lartigue was also in attendance and had actually set up a length of his monorail to exhibit in the hope of selling his idea to one of Britain's several railway companies. Hewson saw Lartigue's unique railway as a huge opportunity for this area and indeed for his own business interests, and so after lengthy discussions over several days, he persuaded the Frenchman to trial his idea in North Kerry and then set about securing the government funding to have the railway built. The landlord must have had some serious clout in the corridors of power at Westminster, because he managed to get some very influential MPs and government ministers on board, and in a matter of weeks a bill was passed by the House of Commons, and the sum of £33,000, or the equivalent of roughly €3.5 million in today's money, was allocated to build the railway, and so in April of 1886 the Listowel Ballybunion Railway Company was formed with Edward Courtney, the 12th Earl of Devon, as its chairman. Land had to be purchased from farmers and landowners along the 9-mile stretch between Listowel and Ballybunion, while rolling stock, staff and materials also had to be sourced, which naturally took time. But with everything in place by the autumn of 1887, work on the new railway was able to commence. Fritz Baer, a German railway engineer and expert, was hired as managing director of the new company, and it was his job to oversee the construction and the completion of the project, while Edward Cook was hired as the general manager and Arthur Gore as the resident mechanical engineer. The track was the easiest part of the job as it was prefabricated, making it quick and easy to assemble, but there was much more to build than just the track. Listowel already had a railway station, as the town was part of Ireland's main railway network, but another smaller station for the Lartigue was needed, along with a turntable to enable the train to turn around and face for Ballybunion following the inward journey. 2 other stations with turntables were also required at Listowel and Ballybunion, while an additional spur of the track and a second turntable was also added at Ballybunion, which extended from the station to an area that is today close to the 6th tee of Ballybunion's famous Old Course, to enable the drawing of sand from the sandhills by special tipping carriages known as hoppers. 4 men were employed on a full-time basis solely for the purpose of loading the sand onto the hoppers, which were then transported to Listowel or even further afield, enabling the sand to be sold commercially by the landlord George Hewson for the princely sum of 1 penny per tonne. As the elevated railway line crossed the countryside like a fence, bridges were needed to provide roadways across the line, and 5 of these had to be constructed, which at the time were the very first structures in Kerry where reinforced concrete was used. 2 of these bridges can still be seen today, one at Gurtniskehe in Ballybunion close to the Parklands Mobile Park, and the second in Listowel close to McKenna's Yard at the entrance to the town, while a small steel suspension bridge was also needed to enable the crossing of the River Gale between Listowel and Listowel. The needs of the farmers who owned land on either side of the track were considered also in the construction of the new railway line, and a series of 17 drawbridges known as flying gates were built to facilitate movement across the track. Operated on a weights and pulley system, when lowered, these drawbridges rested on the elevated track, and so it was also necessary to erect a double ditch, one on either side, to make the transition over the track level in order to facilitate animals and farm carts, and even later on motor cars going across. And while driving the main road from Ballybunion to Listowel today, one can still observe parts of these double ditches along the route. The drawbridges are flying gates, some of which were located at places like Curratusan, Derra East, Shrone West, Ballydonoghue, Kilmulhan, Barnadarrig and Gurtniskehe, always remained locked, with each farmer whose land crossed the track provided with a key, and when in use they were linked to signals which stopped the train approaching from either direction. The engines and the carriages had to be specially made in England at considerable expense, because each of the 3 locomotives had 2 boilers and 2 cabs balanced on either side of the rail, with the driver riding in one cab and the fireman in the other. Designed by the legendary railway engineer Anatole Mallet from Switzerland, the locomotives were painted red and green and were built by the Hundredth Engine Company of Leeds in Yorkshire. Having been tested and approved, they were then dismantled and transported to Listowel by ship and by rail, where they were reassembled once again by the engineers from the Hundredth Company who had travelled across with them. The passenger carriages, 13 in total, were manufactured by the Falcon Engine and Car Works in Loughborough, Leicestershire, while the goods wagons and the sandhoppers, 21 in total, were manufactured in Belgium. After several months, everything was finally in place and the project was completed, surprisingly coming in under budget. Although the train did not go into public service until March 5th, 1888, the grand opening took place on Wednesday, February 29th, and the stations at Listowel, Liselton and Ballybunion were adorned with flags, bunting and banners, while a brass band played the popular music of the day in Listowel as a group of local dignitaries and even some members of the British Parliament who had come over from London for the occasion boarded the train for the historic 9-mile journey, which was to take roughly between 35 and 40 minutes. The train pulled out of Listowel station at noon with over 100 passengers aboard, and hundreds of people had gathered along the route to witness the great occasion and to cheer as the train passed by. Ballybunion was bathed in a carnival atmosphere as huge crowds awaited patiently for the arrival of the train, and after alighting, many of those on board undertook a stroll around the town and across the beaches to soak up the fresh seaside air, after which they enjoyed refreshments in several of the town's hostelries, which were doing a roaring trade, before boarding the train for the return journey later that afternoon. There were naturally some teething problems and the return journey was actually delayed by over an hour due to some minor issue with one of the wheels, but this was just the beginning of the railway's problems. One of the main complaints from day one was the noise in the carriages as the wheels rode along the top of the A-frame, and the excuse given at the beginning was that everything was new and would settle down after a time. But in spite of the best efforts of resident mechanical engineer Arthur Gore, throughout its 36 years in existence, the Lartigue was famed for its noisiness, even in the first-class carriages. The hill at Gurtnaskeha on the approach to Ballybunion presented its own challenges also, with a full load of passengers and freight on board, and the guard would often alight from the train and shout the immortal words, "First-class passengers, remain seated. Second-class passengers, please get out and walk. Third-class passengers, please get out and push." Loads had to be evenly balanced also, which was very much a time-consuming process. And for example, if a farmer wanted to send a cow to market in Listowel, he would also have to send 2 calves to balance it, while the calves would then have to travel back home on opposite sides of the same freight wagon, thereby balancing each other out, and the same applied to human passengers who would naturally vary in weight. A popular story told at the time and handed down through the generations, whether true or not, involved 2 couples from County Limerick who were about to board the train one August morning at Listowel for a day out at the seaside in Ballybunion. One couple consisted of a slim-built man and woman, while the other couple were both rather large and overweight. They were asked by the station master Patrick McCarthy to split up and match their opposite gender and body type for the journey to balance the train. However, it is said that when the train arrived back in Listowel that evening, 2 new pairs of lovers emerged from the carriages. You must remember, of course, that the carriages were divided left and right like panniers, and passengers sat back to back on either side of the track rather than facing forward like a conventional train carriage, and they could not pass from one side of the carriage to the other while the train was in motion. This was only possible in the station by way of a footbridge on each carriage, while the train also carried a special carriage with another footbridge which allowed passengers to cross from one side of the track to the other. The railway was largely a success in terms of its usage for the first 25 years or so, carrying passengers, livestock, goods and sand between the 2 towns, and almost 40 people were employed on a full-time basis. The summer months were naturally the busiest, and things got even busier, as by 1893 the new Ballybunion Golf Club had opened, with the railway playing its own part in the club's development by transporting well-heeled individuals from all over the country to play the new links. while there was always a steady stream of people from neighbouring counties who just wanted to spend the day at the seaside. The monorail was also used to haul in building supplies for the new St John's Church, which opened in Ballybunion 4 years later in 1897, and it also brought in most of the materials for the building of the Marconi wireless station at Sandhill Road, which began in 1913. Although the railway was constantly in use, the company, however, rarely turned a profit, except for 1 year, 1913, when it carried over 44,000 passengers. But the emergence of road travel and the motor car was beginning to take its toll. The outbreak of World War I, followed by the Easter Rising in Dublin of 1916, were to have a huge effect on travel to this part of the country, with the numbers of passengers dropping alarmingly, while the subsequent War of Independence 3 years later in 1919, followed by the Civil War, were major contributory factors to the demise of the monorail. Britain had to relinquish control of the railways to the new Irish Free State government as part of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which brought an end to the War of Independence in 1921. But a bitter civil war followed in 1922 for almost 12 months, and the anti-treaty guerrilla forces in fiercely Republican North Kerry sabotaged the railway on several occasions, causing damage to the line itself and to the rolling stock. But however, in spite of this, the service continued. The Civil War ended in May of 1923, and for a while things improved for the railway. But in early 1924, the Free State government set about amalgamating all of Ireland's various railway companies into one, and sadly they excluded the Lartigue. The reason being was that because of its uniqueness, it couldn't travel to or be used in any other part of the country. A new improvements committee had been set up in Ballybunion to develop and market the emerging seaside resort, and they continuously lobbied the new railway company for months to include the Lartigue as part of the national rail network, but to no avail. It was becoming obvious that the faltering railway needed propping up, as it could not operate much longer outside of the main network. And in a bid to save money, General Manager T.C. Moore, my great-grandfather, who had taken over from Patrick McCarthy upon his retirement in 1917, implemented a policy of using black turf instead of coal to power the locomotives. But this wasn't enough to save the railway, and the end was nigh. On August 15, 1924, the train broke down near Listowel as people were trying to get to Ballybunion for the Pattern Day, and over 100 passengers were left stranded and forced to walk 4 miles, vowing never again to use the railway. The Listowel Ballybunion Railway Company was by now on its knees financially, and having tried and failed again to persuade the new railway network to change their minds, they, along with the local improvements committee, turned to the Free State government for help, but none was forthcoming. And on October 7th, the High Court in Dublin granted permission to the receivers to sell off the company's assets. Justice James Meredith, who presided over the case, said he did so with regret, as he was familiar with the quirky railway, having holidayed in Ballybunion. And 1 week later, on Tuesday, October 14th, 1924, the train made its final journey from Ballybunion to Listowel, bringing down the curtain on 36 years of the Lartigue Railway. The Kerry Reporter, a now defunct local newspaper, reported the following week: the Lartigue Railway Company and the residents of Ballybunion have failed in their efforts to persuade the Free State government and the Great Southern and Western Railway Company to take over the line, and the town is now to be cut off from railway communication with the outside world. Defective though the Lartigue Railway was, it was a necessary factor in bringing to Ballybunion the degree of prosperity that it enjoyed during its 36-year lifetime, and if not immediately replaced by another form of cheap transport, then the future for the local hotel keepers is anything but bright, and indeed many of them might soon find their occupation gone. The people of Ballybunion now have 7 or 8 months to find an alternative means of transport before the start of next season, and they will be well advised to set about this task at once. Well, as we know, the railway was never replaced, but thankfully people did continue to come to Ballybunion for their holidays and to play golf, and for decades after, the town was one of Ireland's busiest seaside resorts. However, one can't help but wonder how Ballybunion might have developed even further over the last 100 years with a railway connection. A few weeks after the Lartigue's final journey, The following notice was published in all local and national newspapers on Saturday, November the 8th. Private tenders are invited for the sale of 4 goods wagons, 17 sand wagons, 3 locomotive engines and tenders, 6 passenger cars, 2 vans and 10 miles of monorail, property of the Lartigue Listowel Ballybunion Railway Company. Sealed offers to be sent to T.C. Moore, General Manager, Ozone Terrace, Ballybunion before December 1st. That was effectively the end of the Lartigue monorail until 64 years later in 1988, which marked the centenary of the opening of the railway, and we will continue the story in our next podcast at a future date. So, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed what we had to offer today. Join me again real soon for part 2, and thank you for tuning in to Ballybunion.